There we go. Right. Yeah, somehow I had forgotten completely about this. So yeah, so please bear with that. So one minor error, I totally forgot about this particular scenario. And that should pretty much help around to begin with. Now, let's go back to this. Um, Not sure if there was a message that I had gotten in between, but it's fine if you would like to specify something or let me know something. We can work around that appropriately. But yeah, let's go back ahead to this case now. Now, in this case, when I run this code again, oh yeah, we need to first select again some default things. That is, we need to first select whatever database we want, and within that database, we need to then create the table and work around. Again, I am terribly sorry for this. How do I say it? Very basic points that have just gone away. So I'm just gonna just work around this to make sure. So just to point back into this, once we have connected to our SQL server, we have listed all the databases. We need to select a particular database in order to create our table. Once we have selected a particular database to create our table, we can then insert within that particular table. So yeah, let's go ahead and select a particular database. For our reference, I'm just going to select MySQL. So I'm just going to use cursor.execute use MySQL. Let's just try this out. Right, this is so far good. So if I run this again, yeah, it says table Pokemon already exists. So create table is not an issue. We are able to create a table. So this is what we have done. We have first executed this to connect to a database that is MySQL as the database. Now, moving ahead, after connecting to the database, the next thing is to create a table within the database, which we just did using this. Once we have created, let's say, our table within this database, the next thing is to connect ahead and start performing insert operations. So I'm just going to replace this with backticks as well. All right, let's see if this works, hopefully. Right, it says table Pokemon already exists, but it did not give any other errors. You can see here, this particular command failed. And once this particular command failed, that this table is already available, because let's face it, it's already there. We just have to go ahead and execute the next ones. Let's run this. Yeah, all of these are basically inserted in our table now. So yeah, apologies for a couple of minor errors that I've just performed within this. The whole idea here is that one, because I generally switch between databases a lot, I end up forgetting connections. So please bear with that one minor mistake where I forgot to select the database initially or use the right database in order to create tables. This is purely because I was thinking of MongoDB, which I want to give you a little preview of right after we do this, because that's a beautiful database in its own way. And I just want to give you a heads up to know that you don't have to necessarily use SQL always. When the situation arises in a scenario where your schema might change over time, instead of messing up your whole table and whole database and changing your schema, there are certain databases that don't have schema, where you can store literally in any way you want, and you can access data in many particular ways. So I just wanted to give you a heads up and an intro to that. But I was thinking of that particular database for quite a lot while moving ahead with that. So yeah, let's ignore that and for now, and please bear with that for now temporarily. Moving ahead, back to this. So we are able to use a database. We are able to create a particular table. We have closed the commands to connect to that anymore. We are able to insert elements. Let's also comment this out. Now the only thing left out is to see whether these elements exist or not within that database, with whether these rows really exist in that database or not. So that's one thing we're just going to see. But prior to that, if you have any queries so far, please feel free to let me know. Um, Please make sure you use backticks. That's one thing that's important to note. So yeah, if any queries, please let me know. Right, I presume no queries so far. All right. So yeah, these are the basic things that we just need to know and remember to begin with, which of course, when we work on SQL databases, we know. So just need to make sure that we add these ahead here as well. Anyway, let's go ahead and use MySQL database now. And let's create a different query this time. That is, let's create a select query. And since there might be a lot of data over here, I'm just going to use select star from Pokemon, and I will limit it to 5. Now, as you know, I have not created any IDs or primary key relationships or any such. I've just created a simple database only to run query. And my only purpose is to run these queries in such a way that we get to know how these work. That's the whole purpose. That's all there is, nothing else. Right. Now, let's select from this table and we're going to limit it just to 5. We're going to run this query. Again, to run this query, the same logic, use cursor, execute of the select query. And once you do this, just go through each element of this cursor and print them. So to go through each element of this cursor, we use cursor dot fetch all. There are fetch one, fetch many as well, but we're going to fetch all. And we're going to go through each row within it. So I'm just going to write for row in cursor dot fetch all for each row. I'm just going to print that particular row. That's pretty much all we're doing. Let's try running this and let's see. There we go. We've got our output as expected. So you've got all these data that you have. This is basically how you can connect to SQL databases, perform some simple operations. Just the most important thing you need to know is in except block, make sure rollback is there. This will keep your ACID compliance in check. And in finally, make sure that you're closing the cursor and the connection as well. Now, moving along with this, the next part of this that I just want to give you a heads up about is every time you connect to your SQL database, you don't have to create a connection. But this is what we are doing here. This is what we are doing in our case right now. But every time you connect to your SQL database, you don't have to create a connection object. You can keep one connection object and you can keep using it every single time. This is one thing that you can do. And this is one thing that you have complete knowledge of on how to do. So what I'm just going to do right now is show you a little logic on how you can perform this, on how you can perform this simple logic or simple idea of ensuring that you have connection pooling in such a way that you have only one connection object which gets to use the database constantly. And I'll just point out one reason why it's hugely important. Think about this simple case scenario. For each query, you're going to connect to database and execute. You're going to create a cursor object. Then you're going to close the cursor object. Then you're going to close the connection as well. This will add 1, 2, 3, 4 additional overheads to your program, which makes it quite complicated. It really makes the whole thing complicated. So here's how we resolve it. Here's how we get to work around it. The way to do this is, if you remember, we have something called Singleton class. And this is something we learned about, we worked on a while ago. So as a small assignment, what I can give you, something that I would ask you to try out is, where did we go with Singleton classes? I forgot where we placed it. There we go, here it is. In this case, only difference you need to do is, in this double underscore new double underscore, instead of making it score as 0, I'll just point this out. Instead of making it score as 0, make a connection created over there. That's it. Create this connection over here. Once this connection is created over here, any person who connects to this class, let's call this class as database. Any person who connects to this class database, they will have that one connection alone. And that one connection alone will be performing every query that you want to do. That's the whole idea. Now, the basic idea here is, as I pointed out, if you have a complete Excel file and you want to insert everything, we were able to do it in a short time over here. It's not just about that. It's also about making sure that you can run this at any time in an automated way to get data or information from a web or from somewhere else and perform some operations so that it can execute all this information. So there are a lot of things that we can do within this. That's something that's really good to know and learn if you're getting into this in detail. So one suggestion I would highly provide is, try adding this connection within this singleton class by renaming it as database. Create a couple of objects, try to do a couple of queries using these objects. It should make sure that all these queries are done using this single connection and single cursor that you have created. Most of the time, just for our reference, just so we get to know, you will have a separate class to access each database. Again, these are some practices we follow often, so I just want to point this out. You will have a class called, let's say, userdb or user database. You'll have a separate class called authentication database. You'll have a separate class similarly called, let's say, um, content database or whatever it could be. So in any database that you get to access, you use that. And within that particular database, you can access any table and perform any operation. All you need to do is pass the table and the operation to a function. To the function, just pass perform query and just pass the table and the query. That's it. Once you do this, you can go ahead and perform any kind of query you want in that code. That is the whole idea of using singleton classes with MySQL connector. Now, moving ahead. Um, okay, just to ask, um, before we go on to further things, before we go on to the next part of this and work around them, just to ask one simple question. Would you like me to walk through singleton class connection with database ones, or would you be willing to try that out so that you get to know how a single connection is enough to use in many objects? And I'll tell you one more reason why we need this. If you have a repo.py where you're going to create your singleton class called database, if you're using this repo.py in multiple files, one is called tts.py, one is called just service.py, let's say another file called network.py or signup.py, signin.py, whatever it is. All of these, if they create an object of this singleton class DB, they will only have one connection. And that one connection will not close until you close your entire application. So you can close that connection only when you close the application, which means only one connection will exist. Database does not have to switch between connections constantly. And you can make sure that having one connection, you don't have to create a connection and get response again and again, which puts up additional stress on the database and additional time taken. So with this thought process, would you like to try this singleton class for a database connectivity by yourself, or would you like me to just walk us through it? Please let me know. Whatever you prefer, we can try that out. So any response would help out a lot. All right, let's try it out. Awesome. In that case, let's take a look at this and let's see how this works out. Right. So yeah, thanks for letting me know. So the response itself pretty much helps me out to just get to know what we would like to do. Right. So let's give that a little try. Just gonna create a new file called O2 singleton Sql.py. Now, Ben, I'm so sorry if you were about to type something or ask a query. Please feel free to please don't hesitate. All right. Right, let's get back to our current case. Now, within this, let's start it from scratch. We're going to import MySQL connector, and we're going to create a class called MySQL Singleton for our easier understanding. This is for our easier understanding. We're just creating it. Now, the usual thing to do is by default create an instance which is none, indicating that no objects are created of this class. It's the same thing that we done before. No objects are created of this class yet. At this, okay, again, while we are doing this, I'll also open up refactoring.guido and I'll go to design patterns and I'll open up the particular design pattern of singleton class as well. There we go. So yeah, as we know already, ensure that a class has just one object and anybody who wants to access will access the same object. We know that it's just that the same object will be accessible every single time. And I think they specify here, yeah, the first example they specify is the database. That is, again, they specify the same thing. In this example, a database connection class acts as a singleton. So this means that any object that is created will get to access one single database. This will help you perform all the queries with just one object. For example, a single database object shared by different parts of the programs. Again, same logic what we discussed about, same idea that we thought about. And yeah, this helps out quite a lot in reality. But then again, please make sure which design pattern should be used to here. A very important thing to know is which design pattern you get to use where. So this will help us get to work around. So you can see here, instead of none, they're just using an empty dictionary and they're creating some set of instances and working around. But mostly the logic is pretty much the same as what we do. But yeah, looking into this particular website is going to help you out a lot in being really good developers when you um, think about it. And here's just one reason why I say that. If I implement a SQL connection and I don't know object-oriented programming much, I'm going to implement it like this. But if I know object-oriented programming, And if I want to make a really efficient program, which is only going to take small amount of like connections and is going to use the database efficiently and work around everything, I'll end up working on a singleton class because I know the design pattern. So if you can just take, let's say, a look at one design pattern a day, a month should be more than enough to just complete the whole thing, at least the major ones. And you can take a look at refactoring ahead as well. So yeah, just one thing that I wanted to express so that we can try these out ahead in time. Anyway, let's go ahead and create a new connection. When I create a new connection, um, you might want to connect it with some let's say username and all these sort of things. But I'm gonna assume there's only gonna be one user, so I'm not gonna take any other parameters. We're gonna hard code our username, password, and the database we're gonna select. So I'm not gonna perform any of that over here in our case. Instead, let's take a look at this. Now, in our current scenario, when we create this particular singleton class, we are not taking username, password, or any such thing because we are just taking up a very simple scenario, just obtain an object, all the details we're going to have within this. So let's start with this. If the class instance is none, only then we create the object. Otherwise, we return the existing two conditions that will occur. If underscore instance is none, then it will create the object and then return the created object. Once that object is created, it will replace this none as well. Second time somebody calls it, they see if class instance is none, it's not none. Since it's not none, whatever object it is, that itself will be returned. The if condition will never be executed. That is the simple process of singleton. Just to get back to this. Right, so let's start with this. I'm going to create an instance is equal to, again, same thing as we did before, super of new class, exact same thing that we did before. I'll just use super of our particular class. Again, you can see it's the whole logic is pretty much the same. It's just that the class name we are changing. The rest of the thing is basically the same right now. Dot new class. This is how a new object will be created. Once this object is created, I need to have a connection for this object. So let's do that. For this particular object, previously, we had a score variable. This time I'm not going to have a score variable. This time I'm going to have a connection object. So this time within this, I'm going to have a connection object. And to make that connection object, let's create another function called um, connect to my SQL. And since it's a function, I need to always use self for it. So what I'm going to do here is with this instance, I'm going to call connect to MySQL. And once I call connect to MySQL, again, please remember previously we just created a variable. This is class dot underscore instance will be the only object that will be there of this class. In our current case, we are creating only one object. And within that one object, instead of creating a variable, I'm creating instead of creating a variable called score, I'm creating a variable called connection. And the value for that connection will come from this separate function. This function will return the entire connection that we know as before, this particular object. It's going to create an object and it's going to return it. So let's create an object and return it. MySQL.connector.connect of host equals localhost, and then user equals user, and finally password equals password. That's pretty much it. So that's the whole thing. We are creating a connection variable. That connection variable will be created by calling this function. This function is going to create a new MySQL connection. Once that is done, we're done with it. If you want, you can also select the database you want to connect to. In my case, I'm just going to use MySQL database because that's where we have our Pokemon, let's say, table. So yeah, you can either use a database later on, or you can just connect it here itself. There are multiple ways for us to do that. I'm just connecting here to avoid running into that query again. That's pretty much it. Now let's go on to the next function. Before we do anything, one important function we need to create is close connection. Because once your program ends, you need to call close connection at that time. So I'm just going to use self.connection.close. Right. Now, let me just walk through what we have just done here. In our current logic, we are creating a singleton class called MySQL singleton, where no objects are there. Whenever the first object is created, we're going to check, or whenever any object is created, we're going to check if this instance is none. If it is none, that means no objects are created. At that time, we're going to create one object. For that one object, we're going to create a connect variable called connection. And that variable called connection will get its value from this function. This function is going to return this connect object. Whatever we had stored here as connect object, this whole connection will be returned here. Once this is done, the next step is to just return that object for anybody to use. If an object is already created, then this won't be none. This will have a connector and everything associated with it. Since it is not none, this logic will directly return the object that is created. And one important thing to do for every database connectivity is to know how and where and when to close the connection. And we're going to create one more function called execute query. And just know that one thing, in reality, when we start to work on these programs in reality, uh, we will never have a single function called execute query. We will never do that. And I'll tell you why. If we have a single function called execute query, anybody can just make any query and make a call to execute query, and they can execute any query that they want. It could be deleting some content, it could be retrieving every content, whatever it could be. So anybody can literally do that, and we don't want that to happen, right? So for that particular purpose, uh, we separate these functions, just like how you know about SQL injections, where people just write 1 = 1 and work around things. To avoid that, we have many methods, right? So, but I'm not going to go into that part of SQL. I'll go into Python alone. In Python, instead of execute, let's say query, you'll have insert as a separate function, delete as a separate function, find as a separate function. You'll have multiple functions separately. And here's how we do it in programming language to make it easy. In programming languages, your purpose is not to write entire queries. It seems easy to write entire queries, agreed, but your purpose is not to write entire queries. Instead, I'll give you a very simple example for this. Let's take a look at this. If I want to select n values, this is what I do. So I can just execute this. For example, let's say it could be select query, and you can write this. Now, here's the problem. In this, you have to retrieve the query from wherever you're typing, and that query you have to place here. Instead of having to do this each and every time, there's a better way to work around this, and I'll show you how. The better way is in this function, apart from self, specify what are the important things you need to add to the query. One, what do you want to select? Selection criteria. By default, if the user does not send it, it is star. Then you'll have limit. By default, if the user does not send it, it is 100. So when the user sends a selection criteria, what you end up doing here is in select, you'll just make it a separate string and just add selection criteria and move ahead. Similarly, for limit as well, you just go to the end of the string, add plus, and add whatever limit user wants to add. So if user wants to specify this, they can. If user wants to skip it, they can. You can also make limit equals none. At this point of time, you need to do two queries. If limit is none, you just have to run without this. You can write else this whole thing with the limit.